Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erica Walker, Professor of Mathematics Education and the Director of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education here at Teachers College. Welcome to the 6th Annual Edmund Gordon Lecture. The Gordon Lecture was begun several years ago by the previous director of UME, Dr. Ernest Morrell, in collaboration with the Office of the Provost, headed by Thomas James. The Gordon Lecture is named for our very own Dr. Edmund Gordon, who is Richard Martineau Professor of Psychology and Education Emeritus here at TC. Nearly 50 years ago, Dr. Gordon founded the Institute for Urban and Minority Education with a mission to improve the education and life outcomes of children, youth, and adults of color in urban settings. In keeping with Dr. Gordon's incredible research legacy and innumerable contributions to policy and practice, the Gordon Lecture seeks to bring leaders to our campus to give an address, to educate, inspire, challenge, and contribute to discourse about research, practice, and policy around key educational issues. We are delighted to have all of you here and know that you will find today's lecture by Professor Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, a luminary in our field, informative and compelling. We also hope you'll be able to remain after the conclusion of today's address for a short program honoring the lecture's namesake, Dr. Edmund Gordon, who I'm pleased to report is here and just last month celebrated his 98th birthday. We are fortunate to have his guiding light here at TC as a beacon for us all. With that, I turn the program over to our TC president, Dr. Tom Bailey.
So I want to begin by welcoming all of you who are here for this year's Reimagining Education Summer Institute and those who have come for this year's Edmund Gordon Lecture. So welcome. Now it's great to see this auditorium filled with educators, scholars, all united in one common purpose: to improve the quality of education in order to promote academic achievement for all learners. For that to happen, teachers need to develop the tools and understanding to work with children from diverse backgrounds while broadening their conceptions of what constitutes intelligence and ability. That work, in turn, needs to draw on expertise and best practices, not just in education, but also in psychology, health, nutrition, and other areas. We need to marshal these perspectives because even the most effective teaching strategies won't work if a child is hampered by anxiety or fear, or if she isn't getting enough to eat, or if he's suffering from poor health. We also need to create approaches that are big and broad enough to be applied on a mass scale, yet flexible enough to be tailored for any child's individual circumstances. As Amy Stuart Wells often points out, there's really no other college in education that could lead this work, because no other college of education has the breadth, depth, and expertise across all of these areas that we do at Teachers College. All of us who study or talk about broad yet adaptable approaches to helping children and family, or who work to improve education in order to advance learning and social justice, are really building on the legacy of one of the preeminent psychologists and scholars of this or any age, and arguably the shaper of Teachers College at its best, Edmund W. Gordon. In the early 1970s, Ed Gordon founded TC's Institute for Urban and Minority Education, UME, one of the first university-based programs to research improving education and outcomes for city youth. Now, Ed, who is a psychologist, zoologist, preacher, and policymaker, is a kind of one-man multidisciplinary institute unto himself. Now, he said he wanted to take Teachers College, quote, into the community. His goal, he said, was for the college to be more actively involved in changing the conditions under which kids live and the conditions that support their broader intellectual development. In doing so, Ed was channeling the giants who mentored him, giants like W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ed has paid their legacy forward magnificently by mentoring thousands of accomplished scholars, including, quite notably, the current director of UMI, whom you just heard from, one of our country's eminent scholars in mathematics education, Dr. Erica Walker. Indeed, all right. Indeed, Ed Gordon's family tree of all the scholars, scholar activists, policymakers, and leaders he has mentored just might be the tallest giant sequoia in the world of academic genealogy. It certainly ranks as one of his major contributions. Another contribution, a signature contribution, and among his most revolutionary, is supplementary education. The idea that when kids lack exposure to libraries, museums, music, the outdoors, mentoring, and other forms of enrichment, society needs to level the playing field by providing that enrichment for them. At 98, Ed is still going strong, and we are forever in his debt. After today's lecture that bears Ed's name, we will have a reception in Everett Lounge where I will do that here. I'll have the great honor of presiding over what I know will be a historic and joyous occasion, the unveiling of a commissioned portrait of a TC giant, and that giant is none other than Ed Gordon. By the way, we were going to do the unveiling in Everett Lounge, but the crowd was so big that we had to do it here. So stick around for that. Now, by the way, another of Ed's many accomplishments is that for a period of 2 years, during a critical moment in TC's development, he served as Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs. And it is my great pleasure right now to introduce his newest successor in those roles, Dr. Stephanie Rowley, who became TC's Provost, Dean, and Academic VP on July 1st. Like Ed, Stephanie is a wide-ranging thinker who has served as an educator, a researcher, a psychologist, and an administrator. In her own scholarship, Stephanie has explored how parents' social experiences, attitudes, and beliefs influence the ways in which they socialize their children, and how that socialization process in turn affects children's motivation in school. As an institutional leader, Stephanie has been quite successful in promoting multidisciplinary collaborations that harness collective intellectual firepower. As Associate Vice President for Research at the University of Michigan, Stephanie brought social scientists and humanists together in key multidisciplinary initiatives, such as M-City, in which the university is working with a consortium of nearly 60 companies to further develop autonomous vehicle technology while, I think crucially, studying its long-term societal implications. The M-City test facility is an actual small city on the UM campus that's used to test drive autonomous vehicles. Now, I warned Stephanie before she came here that we don't quite have the physical space to launch something like M-City at TC. Unless I don't think we've hired her to get into real estate development, but that would be what we'd have to do. But I did assure her that we have the intellectual breadth and depth to do equally impressive and far-reaching things. And with Stephanie now on board at TC, I know that we are already closer to achieving them. Please join me now in welcoming Stephanie Rowley.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for the warm welcome. This is an absolutely beautiful crowd. I'm so happy to be here today. So hello, TC students, faculty, staff, and so many guests who I've seen milling around the halls today. It's been a great day. I'm really thrilled to have a few moments to introduce today our speaker, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. I should say that, obviously, July 1st, this is my first official activity at TC, and I couldn't be more pleased to have this particular event be my first activity. The 6th annual Edmund W. Gordon Lecture at the Reimagining Education Summer Institute. So I grew up, intellectually speaking, on Dr. Gordon's groundbreaking work. So as a young undergraduate student at the University of Michigan, I learned from Dr. Gordon that cultural difference is not deficit, and that social science might spur social justice activities. This work inspired me to think about doctoral work, really understanding that my own research could make such a difference in the world. Indeed, Dr. Gordon mentored and inspired a generation of scholars to thickly describe Black culture and its implications for youth and schooling. So I thank you for that work. How appropriate is it then that today's speaker is Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings? She has moved. Also a giant in the field, and in many ways has birthed a new area of education research in culturally relevant pedagogy. At a time when many were still considering African American culture something to be tamed or redirected, Dr. Ladson-Billings demonstrated how celebrating culture and leveraging its strength would lead to classroom success. I appreciate that these practices were not presented as alternatives or as radical, but rather simply good teaching that benefit youth of all backgrounds. Dr. Ladson-Billings is the former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, having retired in 2018. She was the president of the American Education Research Association, as well as president of the National Academy of Education. A pedagogical theorist, her research examines sociocultural issues in classrooms and teaching, recognizing the power of culture as a means for supporting education of all children. And of course, she's best known for coining the term culturally relevant pedagogy. In addition, she includes critical race theory in her applications to education. She's the author of the critically acclaimed books, The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, and Crossing Over to Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms, as well as many, many journal articles and book chapters. She's the former editor of the American Education Research Journal and has won numerous awards. I will not detail them all, but many, many awards for her groundbreaking work and her leadership in the field. She holds several honorary degrees and was the recipient of the 2018 AERA Distinguished Research Award and elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018. As I said, a giant in the field. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings to TC.
Thank you all for taking the time out today to be here. I am really a little bit overwhelmed. You know, I kept getting emails and tweets and texts saying, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be there. I'm like, you know, this is sort of like that Martin Luther King thing where people say, oh, I was marching with him, you know. But it really wasn't so. And so I was like, no, they just saying they're going to be there, but you showed up. You know, it become kind of a custom or practice in the social sciences for those who stand before groups of people to do a land acknowledgement. If you think about this city, this state, it is home to 10 federally recognized tribes. And specifically on Manhattan Island is the Shinnecock Indian Nation that we acknowledge that we weren't the first people here. There's someone here, and we give a kind of deference to the fact that they were here in this place. But a special thing about New York is that it is also the place of the African burial ground, and that something like 15,000 African descent people were buried, many in enslavement in this place, and so we acknowledge that also. I want to first of all give some thank yous. I want to thank Amy Stewart Wells. She was dogged in getting me to do this. I was supposed to have been here last year, and I said, no, I got another commitment, and so we kept on, and I promised her, I said, you know, get on the schedule early, make sure it happens. So thank you, Amy, for not forgetting. She is a dear colleague and friend. Those of you who are in the academy know you have colleagues, and sometimes you have friends. They don't always turn out to be the same people. But she's one of those folks who is both a colleague and a friend. And I want to thank her entire team who are working with her in the Reimagining conference. I also want to thank Erica Walker. Dr. Walker has just been so magnanimous. She turned her office over to me, just take your time, do this. But then I learned she's trying to steal one of my colleagues, so, okay. That's not gonna happen, okay? Not gonna happen. But most of all, I want to thank Ed Gordon. Ed's work has guided my career and countless others in the fight for equity and justice. Listening to Ed's family tree, I figured out I'm gonna worm my way into the tree. I'm in that tree somewhere, Ed. Let's do the genealogy. That in fact, 28 years ago when I first came to Wisconsin, I was coming to look for housing and who should be the guest speaker at the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research but Ed. I'd also worked with Ed's daughter, Jessica, when I lived in California. We were working on a project that ultimately became, many, many years later, the Caree book on research on Black education. And I've had several conversations with your son, who's in Texas, where my youngest son lives, and we're trying to get there for me to do this podcast or something. And some years ago, my brother, who is a New Yorker, called me, and he knows nothing about academic education. He is a stone cold capitalist. 37 years with IBM, trust me, he got more money than I can think about, but he does do some good in the community. And he sits on a board for teenage parents. And that board has, it has a schooling component to it, education component to it. And they were searching for someone to write a curriculum, and they sent out an RFP. And so he called me and he says, "Do you know this man, Dr. Edmund Gordon?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Like, how old is this man?" And I said, "Don't worry about how old he is." I said, "If you need somebody to do something, Ed is the right person." And he actually listened to his little sister for once in his life. And so we got a lot of connections, Ed, and I'm just so delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to be here because I always think of New York as my summer home. When I was a kid growing up in Philadelphia, my parents, like many parents in the North, many black parents in the North, had this notion of, oh, it's summertime, we're going down south. And I was like that kid in, the What You Say Willis, like. I was terrified of going to the South, mainly because I was 7 years old when Emmett Till was killed. And I'm like, I can't do that. And I would get physically ill whenever they talked about, oh, we're going down south. So they figured out they wanted to go, they wanted to visit relatives, so they were ready to go, and they packed me up and sent me to my aunt's house in Brooklyn, right? So I went the opposite direction while they spent the summer in South Carolina. So we were in New York not too long ago, and I told my husband, I said, "Can you imagine I was like 14 years old walking around Times Square by myself?" And he's like, "Are you serious?" And I'm like, "Yes, it's safe. It's too many witnesses to do something, right?" That people don't realize how safe New York is. It's like you can't do clandestine things in New York. Somebody everywhere. So I'm really, really glad to be here. And I want to, again, thank Amy for prompting me to do it, because it really forced me to do some different work. So this really is a new talk. If it fails, then we won't tell anybody about it. But hopefully it's a way to think differently about who we are as a nation, particularly in these times. So if my slides are ready, we'll start with I guess I did that, thank you. In June of 2016, The Ford Foundation hosted an Equity Matters Symposium. See, I told you it's summer, June, New York, that's me, right? And they wanted to have they wanted to have education journalists look at how they report on education equity. The major speakers were Stanford University's Sean Reardon, Teachers College Richard Rothstein, and myself. My talk was titled, Facts, Just the Facts, Text and Context and Achievement Disparities in Education Debts. And in it, I tried to demonstrate how education writers fixate on getting the facts without exploring the context in which these facts emerge. So for example, I asked the journalists how many of them had heard of the Flint water crisis. Now, it should be no surprise to you that every hand was raised. But next I asked how many of them were aware of poor school achievement in Michigan urban areas. Again, many hands were raised. But when I asked how many people had read or written a story about the connection between lead in water and student achievement, no hands went up. The journalists had plenty of verifiable facts, but little in the way of context in which we can make real sense of those facts. So my task today is to talk about how having command of a narrative can allow you to both assert facts and construct contexts that don't align with the reality of people's lived experience. So for example, in the recently aired PBS series on Reconstruction, we learned that powerful forces in the former Confederacy helped to reshape the facts of the Civil War. And while the South could not deny it lost the war, it insisted that it had fought for a noble cause. The Daughters of the American Confederacy formed a powerful special interest group that lobbied to change how the war's narrative was portrayed, especially in textbooks that the students would read. So in those books, slavery was good for slaves. It provided them with food, clothing, and shelter. Those same texts argue that Reconstruction was bad, that blacks could not be trusted to govern. This narrative led to the rise of Jim Crow laws and anti-black terrorism. The rise in lynchings in the 1890s that Ida B. Wells so eloquently exposed helped to galvanize black and liberal whites throughout the nation to work collectively against racism. However, it is not merely the Southern Confederate sympathizers who were weaving a narrative. The dominant narrative of the North has been one of both defeat of the Confederacy and freeing enslaved African Americans. That is not the entire story. When we say Lincoln freed the slaves, we are forgetting that the Emancipation Proclamation offered freedom to enslaved African Americans in the Confederacy. It meant nothing to those enslaved African Americans residing in Union states. Lincoln was making a move to punish the Confederacy and to recruit blacks to join the Union Army. The Northern narrative continues as one of enlightenment versus Southern backwardness. The North was home to a growing industrial base, while the South remained primarily an agrarian-based section focused on labor-intensive crops like cotton, tobacco, and indigo. The North was home to elite and established educational institutions like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and Penn, while few universities, high-quality universities, existed in the South beyond Virginia that had the College of William and Mary, Washington and Lee University, and the College of William and Mary. The seat of commerce and industry was in the North. Places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were home to stock exchanges, banking, and insurance. The Yankees were considered sophisticated and linked to the sophistication of England, while outside of the wealthy planter class, Southerners were thought to be backward and uneducated. The fact that enslaved African Americans sought to escape slavery by heading north to Philadelphia or to New York enhanced the Northern narrative as a place of freedom and democracy. In Philadelphia, there were 6 schools for blacks by 1837, with the first documented school established in 1758 by Bray Associates, which was an Anglican philanthropic society. However, in 1818, when the legislature established a plan for educating poor children, it essentially excluded black children. The North-South discourse ignores the ways that the North was complicit in maintaining and profiting from slavery. Some years ago, I received an honorary degree from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And one of the receptions took place at a venue along the Merrimack River. People were bragging about Massachusetts in general and Lowell in particular. I was hearing about how liberal and enlightened the area was, how far ahead of the rest of the country it was. And I listened with feigned interest. Because of the gentrification, many of the old buildings along the river have been converted to condominiums. And so when I asked someone what the buildings were before conversion, he told me that they were formerly mills. We were a mill town. So I then asked, well, what did you mill? The response was textiles. So I then asked, well, what kind of textiles? And the answer was cotton. I then asked, where did the raw cotton come from? And the respondent replied with a somewhat sheepish, southern plantations. Somehow, the enlightened liberal northerner figured out that indeed the North was complicit in slavery. Lehman Brothers, Aetna, J.P. Morgan, and New York Life are just a few of the companies that profited from slavery. Even our esteemed universities trafficked in slavery. Georgetown, Rutgers, Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale all have recently published reports on how they benefited from slavery. Northerners live under the misguided illusion that they had more tolerant, liberal attitudes towards African Americans and slavery. They did not. In 1964, Barry Goldwater was soundly beaten by Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater only won 6 states: his home state of Arizona and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Those states had been solidly Democratic since Reconstruction. But Goldwater's no vote on the Civil Rights Act endeared him to Southern whites. The dramatic images of resistance to school desegregation in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Prince Edward County, Virginia, made many of us believe that the school desegregation issue was confined to the South. However, when the court order came down on the Boston public schools, we all saw that resistance to school desegregation was a national issue. Anti-black racism was pervasive in the U.S. When Richard Nixon ran for the presidency the second time in 1968, the Republican Party came up with the strategy to capitalize on the racial resentment that emerged from the advances of the civil rights movement and the dismantling of Jim Crow laws. The Republican Party believed it could realign politically conservative white voters who traditionally voted Democratic to join them to stem the tide of school desegregation. Now, some other historians have argued that rather than a top-down Republican Party strategy, that there was a bottom-up strategy launched by suburban families who engaged in white flight to avoid school desegregation. For decades, Northerners have comforted themselves by insisting that their schools in the cities and communities were segregated because of what the law calls de facto segregation, while Southern schools were segregated because of de jure segregation. De jure segregation is that which occurs because of the law, and Southern states had laws on their books that prohibited black students from attending schools with white students. De facto means a state of affairs that is true in fact, but not officially sanctioned. So Northern communities argued that their school segregation was not a result of law, but because of housing patterns. My argument is that Northern school segregation was as much de jure as Southern school segregation. And although there were no laws on the books mandating separate schools, Northern states took advantage of restrictive covenants and the proliferation of community-destroying interstates to create geographic barriers between whites and blacks. Now, it's interesting because I wrote about what interstates did to black communities and how they essentially sent white folks out to the suburbs. And the editor of this particular article said to me, well, you can't say that. You saying the government did this? I'm like, yeah. I said, it's not a coincidence that the Interstate Highway Act comes into place right after Brown. That's like Eisenhower's makeup for the decision. Oh, you can't say that. So then I had to go back and find all this data and show this person, this is what happened. I didn't make this up. And in fact, there is a book that speaks directly to this. The interstate highway system was launched in 1956, a year after Brown II, by President David Eisenhower. And it is Samuels in his book that documents how the highway system contributed to urban poverty. An example of how the segregation worked was in Levittown, where there was an attempt to make the American dream a reality for working class veterans after World War II, except for one group of people. So while white GIs could come back to the pride of home ownership, their black counterparts were relegated to public housing units. This was not a subtle form of discrimination. Clause 25 in the standard lease for the first Levitt house that included an option to buy stated the home could not, quote, be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. By 1953, 70,000 people lived in Levitt homes. Not one of them was black. And more important to my education debt thesis is the degree to which Levitt homes appreciated. See, these homes sold originally for about $6,000 with no money down and a $60 a month mortgage payment. A veteran could become a homeowner. This whole story is really interesting to me because I grew up in this era, I was a kid in this era, and my parents were starting to be home buyers then. So my parents bought their first West Philadelphia home for $8,000 in 1949. Today, a Levitt home in suburban New York can go for $565,000. My parents' home has since been leveled to the ground, and the nearest home that I can still find remaining on their block is listed on Zillow for $93,000. Consider the degree of wealth that working class and lower middle class whites have been able to accumulate over the last 60 years compared to their black counterparts, based solely on structural support. Because there's no way that Jacob Levitt could build that many homes on the money he had in his pocket. All of these are underwritten by the federal government. And that clause 25 was prominent in there. Richard Rothstein does an excellent job of documenting how the federal government set up segregated housing projects to ensure that blacks and whites would not have to live together and consequently attend schools together. An interesting thing about Southern versus Northern segregation lies in the different lifestyles and customs of the two sections of the country. So in the South, blacks and whites experience what I think of as a curious intimacy. Blacks have always worked for whites, lived in their homes, cleaned their homes, cooked their meals, nursed and raised their children. In the North, the relationships were more distant and formal. Then, of course, wealthy whites may have had live-in black maids or chauffeurs, but the average working class or middle class northern white person has tangential relationships with blacks. Because they lived in separate neighborhoods and black neighborhoods were assessed at much lower values, the property tax that supported their schools were much lower. This reflects the economic portion of the education debt. So while the South established separate school districts, the North operated single school districts, but with separate resources for students based on race. In instances where black and white students did attend the same school, curriculum tracking ensured that the races remained separate. My own K-12 education in Philadelphia public schools is instructed. I attended a segregated elementary school of almost 700 children. My neighborhood was experiencing white flight, and most of the remaining white children attended the local Catholic school. Only one very poor white family of 17 children attended my elementary school. Which caused us to say, well, at least I ain't like the Kikers, right? Because they were really poor, But it's like everybody else went somewhere else. That's just that one family. Most of my teachers were black. They lived in my neighborhood, and they knew my parents. Now, I excelled in that school because I was encouraged by teachers who insisted that I was capable of achieving whatever I set my mind to. When it came time to attend junior high school, my mother used the address of her younger brother, who had moved to a better neighborhood, to allow me to attend a better, read mostly white, school. It was in that school that I could see the huge differences in resources that distinguished black and white schools. My white classmates wore designer clothes. They typed their assignments. And our mostly white teachers called on them and praised their participation. When I gave a right answer, there was always a raised eyebrow or a look of surprise. My parents had difficulty attending school functions because the school was across town. But they encouraged me the best they could, and I actually graduated with straight A's in my final year. For high school, my mother gave me two choices: the all-girls specialty school or another out-of-neighborhood high school. I'd wanted to go to the mostly black neighborhood school, but knew that my mother had the last say. So I chose the out-of-neighborhood co-ed school. For the most part, it was a good choice. It was the rare, naturally occurring integrated school because it sat on the boundary between a middle-income black community and a Jewish one. It was almost 50% black and 50% Jewish. Well, the funny thing that we would see white kids in our school who weren't Jewish, we would say, "What Catholic school did you flunk out of?" Right? because essentially they didn't come to that school, right? I loved attending high school. I had a vibrant social life and an intellectually challenging curriculum. Because of my junior high school grades and my mother's insistence, I ended up in the college prep track. That was the equivalent of today's honors track. I took classes like Latin 2 and 3, biology, chemistry, algebra 2, geometry, trigonometry, Spanish 1 and 2, English, social, a bunch of electives. And I did well in school, graduating 14th in a class of almost 450 students. Most of my academic courses were filled with Jewish students. We didn't have Jewish holidays off back then. So on a high holy day like Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, it would be like me and the teacher. All right. I saw other black students in gym or health classes or electives or lunch. One semester I was misassigned to a particular English section. And I enjoyed it because it was my first academic class with almost all black students. I was like, oh, wow, this is cool. But I also noticed that the class was exceptionally easy. I aced every test, but at the end of the first 9 weeks, I earned a C. So when I inquired about the discrepancy, the teacher let me know that the highest grade that one could earn in the class was a C. It's weighted that way, right? So when I made an appointment with my counselor, she discovered that I was in the wrong class and reassigned me to a college prep English section. The difference in curriculum and instruction was startling. Now, we're in the same school. In the class with my black friends, we studied a lot of grammar, and we had weekly spelling tests. In my college prep class, we read literature, Melville, Hawthorne, Shakespeare, Jane Eyre, Edgar Allan Poe, Thomas Hardy. We discussed plot, setting, character. We wrote essays. The class was like a college seminar, and it prepared me for what I would experience in college. Learning that there were actually 2 schools operating within the walls of my school helped me to see how inequality could exist in the middle of so-called equality. Similarly, when school desegregation plans were imposed on districts, I saw how whites successfully subverted them. In the South, poor and working class whites began attending Southern academies, staffed by white teachers who had retired or resigned from desegregating public schools. And in the North, magnet programs were established to attract white students and establish separate schools within the same building. White students were in the math, science, technology magnet. Black students were in the regular school. White students were in the performing arts magnet. Black students were in the regular school. White students were in the medical magnet, and black students in the regular school. And northern school districts patted themselves on the back for desegregating their schools. New York is an especially interesting school district with school choice for its high schools. Interesting, the most prized high schools have the lowest proportion of black students. According to the March 18, 2019 New York Times, out of 895 spots in New York's most selective high school, Stuyvesant, only 7 black students were admitted. Last year, only 10 black students were admitted. The year before, 13. Similarly, Bronx High School of Science offered admittance to 12 black students, down from 25 the year before. About 26% of New York City is black. That's more than 2 million people. The very idea that there would only be 7 black students eligible to enter Stuyvesant reflects the degree to which the school system is aligned against black students. And I'm making a point of identifying the population as black as opposed to African American, since in New York we are clearly talking about Caribbean, African, and African American people. It's also interesting because we know that the highest performing subgroup in U.S. schools are Nigerian students. So what accounts for such low numbers at these specialty schools? In the late 1980s, American Federation of Teacher President Albert Shanker gave a speech on the need for teachers to be able to work outside of what he saw as the oppressive rules and regulations of state and district mandates that kept teachers from using their own creativity toward curriculum and pedagogy that they were actually trained to develop and implement. Shanker's argument was linked to improving public schools and empowering teachers. However, in the 1950s, in the same era of the Brown decision, economist Milton Friedman proposed school vouchers with the thought that competition would lead to improved quality. And I want to argue that these two innovations, charter schools and school vouchers, have actually exacerbated school desegregation along both racial, ethnic, and social class economic lines. The interesting thing about school vouchers, that is public money that is used to support students in private schools, is that the initial argument was that they were to be used solely to support children stuck in low-income and failing schools. Milwaukee Public Schools became the most prominent case of public school vouchers. A struggling school district would be tasked with taking money from its coffers and sending it to private schools. There is little evidence that students enrolled in private schools with vouchers are performing significantly better than their public school counterparts. We run this test every year in Wisconsin. Every year, and we have no significant improvement of those students who are in voucher program schools over the Milwaukee Public Schools. Today in Wisconsin, conservative state administration expanded the voucher program to students throughout Milwaukee, Beloit, Racine, and Madison. In Milwaukee, as of October 2018, 129 private schools participate in the voucher program, with 28,917 students in grades pre-K through 12. The district pays between $7,745 and $8,400 per student each year, at a total cost of $221,800,000 in the 2018-2019 school year. I can tell you Milwaukee doesn't have $200,000 to just give to other schools. This represents a 38.4% reduction in the Milwaukee Public Schools budget. Milwaukee's 154 public schools serve 75,081 students. So the students in the voucher program make up almost a third of the overall student population. Meanwhile, Milwaukee continues to suffer with instability in leadership and a lack of funding. This district's student population is 89.2% students of color, 82.5% economically disadvantaged, and 20.3% are designated as having special needs. I argue that the voucher programs have facilitated the remaining white and middle class flight that we see in Milwaukee, and the law has participated in the hyper segregation of the district. It's not segregated merely as a matter of fact or de facto. Milwaukee public schools are segregated de jure, by law. The unique case of the New Orleans Parish schools illustrates what happens when a natural disaster meets a disastrous school district. We must acknowledge that New Orleans had a horrible school system before Hurricane Katrina. Okay, let me be clear about it. I actually wrote an article called Now They're Wet. Okay. It was a bad district before. Okay, now they're wet. But we do know that when Katrina made landfall and wreaked havoc upon the city and surrounding region, it actually destroyed what was left of that infrastructure. However, neoliberal forces took advantage of the tragedy by totally razing the system, firing all 4,600 of the mostly black Orleans Parish teachers. Thus, a significant portion of the city's black middle class lost their jobs. A district that had a 71% black teaching force now has a less than 50% black teaching force, while 85% of the students are black. In addition to the changing teaching force, the entire character of the district changed, moving from traditional neighborhood schools to a city comprised solely of charter schools. So since there are no traditional public schools in New Orleans, every family has to apply to be admitted into a school. The pressure to meet state standards means that schools regularly pick and choose to determine which students will enhance their school's performance. This attempt to enroll the more desirable students means that some students end up on an enrollment merry-go-round, shopping for a new school every year. However, since most of the city's white students are enrolled in private schools, this system is generally aimed at black students. And there is a perverse system of choice that actually means schools are the ones that get to choose, not parents, not students. And when parent and community groups have lobbied to open charter schools, they have been systematically rejected. And they've been rejected in favor of educational management organizations, and all of these machinations are considered legal, once again underscoring my point that it's all de jure. So I want to share a portion of a video of the choice story in New Orleans. I won't show the whole thing, but
The story isn't a story with walls around Louisiana. It's a story about America.
There was no longer anything as a neighborhood school. So theoretically, parents had choice. They could apply to send their children to any school in the city. And that was supposed to be a good thing since some of us didn't have schools in our neighborhood. And initially, right after Katrina, I could see how that could be helpful. But the Recovery School District did not give any thought to their responsibility in helping communities rebuild and being a catalyst for rebuilding by having schools that the neighborhoods can count on sending their children to.
It's connected to really two things. One, educators having the power to determine the educational program rather than bureaucrats, and parents having the power to choose from among a wide array of choices and make the best decision for their kids. And at the core of it, that's the plan. And when you do that, you create energy among both educators who are newly empowered and parents who too are newly empowered, and that makes schools better year over year.
You see, when they start talking about choice, that's fraud. Choice means that you have an opportunity to go somewhere else. You know, they said over and over, parents are dissatisfied, their feet can walk. But if the only other place I can take them is another failing school, where's my choice?
Children no longer have to attend their failing public school in their neighborhood. They get to choose schools. Well, while I'm not an advocate of the status quo of what was, because I truly believe something needed to change, even before the takeover, they could choose. All they did is go down to the permit office and put in for a permit, and you could go somewhere else.
When I was growing up, the process didn't seem as hard. We got up, we went with Mama to go to school. She registered us. Then 2 days later, we would come back to school.
No opens in there. None. So we gonna have to send our children away. If we stand in the east, we gonna have to send them. We gotta send them all the way out. That's not right. It should have left that the way when we were going to school. Just go there in their district, and that's it. We didn't have to worry about all that. They're trying to say it's for the better, but it's not for the better at all.
We now have a group of schools that are basically in the central part of the city, where we had kids coming from the east, the west, the north, and the south. Transportation costs skyrocketed, where pre-Katrina we may have been spending about $300 per child. Post-Katrina, we're spending $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 per child. So in your selective enrollment and in the lack of providing transportation, you indirectly eliminate some children from being able to attend some schools.
You know, there's so many people coming to New Orleans wanting to help with the reform of our public education system, but they didn't come in here and ask us what we wanted. They came in here with their preconceived ideas of what they thought education reform was about before they took the time to get to know us or what our concerns were about our public schools.
Don't send me a charter school that doesn't want to hear what we have to say. We are involved in our children's education. You already shut down my alma mater, and I'm not going to stand here and let you shut down Sarah T. Reed. So let's stand here together and demand that they give us local control.
There is no failing school. The policies are failing. The policies have failed.
If the only choice is failing school A, failing school B, or failing school C, as a parent, I'm disenfranchised. We have all of these.
The latest example of school segregation comes in the form of home and electronic schooling. Now, clearly some parents have religious or ethical standards that suggest their students receive schooling away from the public system. I appreciate that these parents both pay taxes and provide for alternative education for their children. However, increasingly, we see state-provided online schools that families take advantage of to avoid sending their kids to school with those kids. This becomes the new form of segregation. My work in critical race theory forces me to take a racial realist stance towards what is likely to happen regarding school segregation. The historical and sociological evidence has been consistent concerning how a significant portion of the white population feels about school desegregation and the ways that the state has supported their desire to maintain all white communities and schools. We know the following. Most whites by choice live in communities with other white people. My husband and I do this thing where we get invited to things like funerals and weddings, and we're the only black people at the funeral or the wedding. And I remember the last time we went to a funeral, I said, we're the only two black people this man knew in 87 years. I think when I die, some of y'all gonna come to my funeral. I think it's gonna be some white people coming. It just boggles the mind that people have been able to secrete themselves and wall themselves off from other people. We know that most whites by choice send their children to school with other white children. We know that any efforts to compel whites to attend school with students of color will be vigorously resisted and defied. We know that any efforts to equalize resources in black and brown communities with those in white communities will be stymied. And we know that black and brown communities cannot depend on the state to protect their constitutional rights and their educational aspirations. Thus, black and brown communities will do what they have always done. We'll operate in subversive and resistant ways to create the educational spaces and opportunities that our children need. So yes, these communities will take advantage of existing charter school laws to build more independent school spaces. We'll also expand after-school and weekend opportunities like cultural schools, Jack and Jill, religious-led educational opportunities. And we also see an uptick in black participation in homeschooling. We can also expect the continued upturn of interest in attending historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic Latinx serving institutions. The problem is these solutions tend to serve those members of the community who already have access to some resources. The outlook for the masses is not merely as optimistic. Continuing to live in the nation's poorest communities with limited health care services, substandard housing, and poor public schools is more likely to send them to what is becoming the most segregated academies we have, the prison system. I really wanted to end this lecture on an upbeat note. However, I viewed 2 films before I completed the lecture that make it impossible. Anna DuVernay's When They See Us and Brian Stevenson's True Justice. These films reminded me of the enormity of the injustice that infiltrates and corrupts the nation. It's not just the individual cases of people like Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Rekia Boyd, or Philando Castile. It's the collective suffering and the trauma that shapes and characterizes black life in America. The fact that 6 million black people fled the terror of the American South in the largest migration of people the nation has ever witnessed, and we refuse to acknowledge what that did to families and to communities. My own family, on both my mother and father's side, did just that. So how traumatized were they? How did that impact how they raised us? What limitations were placed on our sights because of their fears? I'm not Pollyannish about what education can do. I recognize that the education system is as complicit with the justice system, mass incarceration, the healthcare system, the housing system, the employment system, and now the college admission system, as every other system that records disparity between whites and everyone else. But education and healthcare have unique opportunities to do what is right at much earlier and important junctures of people's lives. We do not have to allow children to go without adequate medical and dental care. We do not have to allow children to go without proper nutrition. We do not have to use systems of exclusion that mimic the prison system to discipline children. We do not have to have armed police officers patrolling the halls of our high schools. We don't have to have teachers and teacher education programs that are so preoccupied with managing black and brown bodies, telling them to walk on a line in school corridors with their hands behind their backs. We do not have to criminalize child and adolescent behaviors like wearing a hat indoors or rolling their eyes. Has nobody taken a course in child and adolescent development? Eye rolling comes with adolescence. Trust me. I've raised 4 of them. They roll their eyes as soon as they turn 13. Right? It's just who they are. Who we are as a nation rides on how we treat the neediest, most disenfranchised members of our society. Instead of hiding behind the mantle of personal responsibility and spinning tales about having enough grit, we must look ourselves and our nation squarely in the face and admit that the dysfunction that we experience is not because of some person or some political party gone awry. This disparity is baked into our society. It's in our laws, it's in our policies, it's in our rules, our ordinances, our customs, and our process. We must be willing to admit it's all de jure. Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. While we're collecting cards, I had a question. You spoke, a lot of what I was hearing made me think about how black and brown suffering has been codified, and the ways in which our suffering and our pain is embedded as part of, this is part of America, part of education, etc. Do you have any thoughts, suggestions on how we as educators or those committed to education can actually do something to A, recognize that suffering, and B, change our educational practice to do something about that?
So your question actually hits on something I've been struggling with for over 10 years. I did a talk some years ago at the Ethnography Forum at the University of Pennsylvania called The Ethnography of Misery, in which I argued that if your suffering is recognized by the society, it can be empowering and enabling. I used to work for the School District of Philadelphia, one of the first, and when I became a supervisor of social studies, I wrote one of the first Holocaust curriculum in the city. And I saw how it empowered people. We sat with Holocaust survivors who initially didn't want to tell these stories. But as they began to tell them and share them, they were like, yeah, you know what, my grandchildren do need to hear these stories. So when people recognize the legitimacy of your suffering, you know, the society recognizes the legitimacy of your suffering, then what happens is you'll be like, yeah, we went through this, and we don't ever want to forget this. But if your suffering is delegitimated, that was a long time ago. I didn't own no slaves. And one of the moments, and why I'm stuck with this particular concept, because I can't figure out, the anthropologists and me can't figure out how to document it, is that you remember the film A Girl Like Me, where the young lady, Media Matters sponsored this. She replicated the Clark's doll study. It's kind of up to date. There's a moment in that film where this little black girl is asked to choose the doll that's like her. And she wants to reach, her first inclination is to reach for the white doll. And she pulls her hand back and reaches for the black doll. And I stopped the film right there. There's a look on this kid's face that is just sheer misery. And I don't know how to capture it, I don't know how to really describe it, but I think the suffering is seen as illegitimate. Oh, you didn't really go through nothing. Again, it was a long time ago. I didn't own no slaves. To our brown brothers and sisters, oh, y'all got somewhere to live. You ain't got to live here, right? I mean, it's this whole notion that your thing doesn't count. It's not a part of it. And I think that that doesn't allow us to be empowered by the suffering. I mean, when I used to teach 8th graders U.S. history, and you know, they'd be embarrassed, they don't want to talk about slavery, and I had to really explain to them, who else could survive this? What you're looking at is the most powerful people in the world. The rest of y'all have been dead. So to try to take back the narrative. That's why I said the narratives are important. To say we put up with some stuff that nobody has put up with. And we're still here. So I think that's part of our work, is reconstructing the narrative, to tell the story from the viewpoint of sort of empowerment. But it's hard because, we've told the story so differently.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a second question, and that is, how do you think the removal of vocational programs and increased focused college prep programs has impacted on urban communities?
I think in many ways it's a hard question because we're looking for that, quote, magic bullet, that thing. Most of what we as public school educators have to do in a vocational setting is really not state of the art with what the vocation demands. I mean, I've been in schools where they have automotive, but they don't have all them computers. They not working on no Teslas. They working on a 72 Chevy, right? So, and schools will never have those kind of resources. So let me give you a different scenario. Some years ago, I was asked to speak to a group in Madison called Leadership Greater Madison. And I wanted to do it because I'd actually gone through the leadership in Palo Alto, one of their first cohorts. So I knew you bring together all these people that you want to contribute to the community, right? You want them to not just go to work every day, but to be on local boards and what have you. And so they asked me to come to talk about education. And one of the things I did is I shared with them a transcript of a young woman. Her name was redacted, but she was one of our local high schools. She happened to be white, and she had like a 3.5 grade point average. And every course on her transcript we all recognized. 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 4 years of social studies, some art, some electives. Then I put up a transcript from another youngster in her class who happened to be black and male, and he had a 3.5. But once you got past his freshman year, we didn't recognize any of those courses. Freshman year, he had English, math, science, social studies. After that, he had work study, community opportunity. I mean, I said, I've been reading transcripts for 35 years. I don't know what this is. So I asked so one of the people who responded said, oh, well, he can go to Madison Technical College. So I said, well, that's true, he could. But I put her transcript back up. And I said, are you saying she can't go to Madison Technical College? Well, yeah. So in other words, she can go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison or Madison Technical College, that she has that choice. Who are we to determine he only gets one choice? So for me, it's not so much about, oh, everybody needs to go to college. It's that everybody ought to have more choices. Everybody ought to have more. And so I'm not sure that just having a vocational program for a job that might not exist is the right way. I would rather have a kid come out of school at 18 and say, I'm not, I took college prep, but I'm not interested in college. Trust me, someone will hire that youngster. My own brother, I mentioned earlier, went to the Wharton School of Finance, got an MBA, and what is the first thing that IBM said to him? Well, we got to get all that Wharton stuff out of you. The idea is, can you learn? And that's really what we want to be able to have kids be able to have more choices. So somebody is monitoring time for me because I'll go on. Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of related questions, and these are directed specifically advice you'd give to black parents, black students, in terms of how do parents and black students navigate an educational system that is, A, not designed for them, but more often than not, those who are taking the lead in those systems are trying to oppress those young people.
Yeah, I actually spend a lot of time with black parents about how to negotiate with white schools or the system, whether the school is white or not, the system has been imposed on them. So And one of the things I've learned, I guess, I never can take off my anthropology hat, is that you have to deal with people in their cultural mode. White folks' cultural mode is paper. Y'all love paper. I'm gonna tell you, if it's on paper, it's real, right? You signed it. You know what? I'll sign anything if I to get what I want, right? So our cultural mode is, I'm speaking for black folks, we're more oral verbal. We're gonna tell you what we think. And so they clash in schools. So I try to help parents figure out, how do you write down what you want to say? And, my kids will tell you, they say, my mama will CC God. When I finish writing, I send the superintendent, the school board president, and if God needed, it'd be God, right? But I've learned that if it's in writing, it takes on a life. And so that's one of the things I try to help parents with. The other thing is, in that typical parent-teacher conference, one of the things I always urge Black and Latinx parents to say is, I said, there's 3 questions you need answered. What does my child know and is able to do? What does my child still need to know and be able to do? And number 3, what can I do to help? Those are the questions you want answered. Do not let people tell you your child is nice. You know that. You sent them nice. That is no value added. I sent you a nice kid. Do not tell me about how nice he is. What does he know? What does he need to be able to do? What doesn't he know yet? And what can I do to help? So really kind of narrowing down what we're going to have the conversation about. We're not going to have no conversation about my child's behavior. Okay, that's not in a academic conference, because the behavior didn't just start that day. You didn't call me before this, so we're not having that conversation. So really helping them kind of get a script ready to say whatever it is. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Got one further question than a comment.
Okay.
This is a sort of related number of themes in terms of de jure versus de facto. If we're in a situation where de jure is grounded in law, but we know that often segregation, issues of inequality are grounded in people's perceptions and their ideology, how do we move or understand the distinction between what is law as opposed to what is someone's preference supported through law?
Okay. So the thing about the law is it reflects the ideologies, the belief systems, and the culture of the society that exists. The laws don't get made outside of that. And so even when we see laws that we see as progressive, you must always be on the lookout for what will destroy that law. So I think Brown is a perfect example. My former colleague, now Dean of the School of Education at Wisconsin, Diana Hess, interviewed every member of the Supreme Court. This is prior to Roberts being on that court. But she interviewed all of them. And her question was, what cases must be taught in our schools? Now, there's a zillion cases, but if we're teaching U.S. government, what cases must be taught? There are 2 cases that all of the justices agreed on. One is Marbury versus Madison, because it's about judicial review. The other one is Brown. All of them think we must teach Brown. But look at all the cases that came behind that ate away at Brown, that really made Brown impotent. So the reason they want Brown taught, because it's a vision of America that actually doesn't exist, but it's what we want to say about ourselves. So I think when you talk about what can be done with the law is limited. I'm actually writing an article for a law review right now called "The Law Can't Do Nothing." And all of the lawyers are like, yeah, you're right. You're right. It can't do nothing. but there's a kind of mysticism about the law. I wrote an article, I did publish an article in the University of North Carolina Law Review called, Could We At Least Have Plessy? In which I argued I'd rather have a real Plessy than a fake Brown. You know, if I'm gonna go to school by myself, you're gonna really give me equal, you know, my teachers are gonna have the same qualifications, I'm gonna have the same money, I'm good, right? When I shared that, and I did it at a conference in North Carolina, all the educators were mortified. But the legal scholars were like, yeah, this is, well, let's think about this. So in some ways, you know, people will see, I would argue that Brown, of course, was the right decision, but that Brown was never an education decision. You got to remember in the beginning of the talk, I talked about context. What's happening in 1954? We're in the middle of a Cold War. We're getting hammered by the propaganda of the Soviet Union about how we treat black people. So it's never been about the schools. It's about what the, you know, how do we get these non-aligned nations to think we're the right choice, right? And so just think about what the law can and can't do. There's a lot of things it can't do, but its symbolism and its power is really quite powerful. So I think I have to stop there.
Yes, thank you.
Right,
I just
thank
wanted
you.
I think this is, I'll read this card, which is a comment, which I think encapsulates what many of us would say here. It says, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, thank you for speaking your truth and the truth that is often untold. You are a legend.
Oh, wow.
I hope to follow in your footsteps.
Oh, thank
you
you.
are doing God's work. Thank you.